Most people believe they understand why they do what they do. People often spend years trying to escape experiences that make them unhappy. Yet many of those same people remain remarkably loyal to patterns that continue producing the very suffering they wish to leave behind. They stay in cycles that exhaust them, repeat behaviors that undermine their goals, and return to ways of living that they have already recognized as harmful. What makes this so difficult to understand is that awareness alone rarely seems to be enough. A person can clearly see the consequences of a habit and still feel strangely attached to it. Most explanations focus on discipline, motivation, or self-control. We assume that if someone continues engaging in a behavior that damages their well-being, then they must lack the determination required to change. While this explanation is appealing because of its simplicity, it fails to account for something essential about the human mind. Human beings rarely maintain patterns for years without a reason. The reason may be unconscious, irrational, or outdated, but it is usually there. What appears to be self-sabotage from the outside often serves a psychological function from the inside. This becomes easier to understand when we stop looking at habits as isolated behaviors and begin viewing them as parts of a larger emotional system. A habit is rarely just an action repeated over time. More often it becomes a way of managing discomfort, uncertainty, vulnerability, fear, or emotional pain. The behavior may create problems, but it also provides something the person experiences as necessary. Consider someone who struggles with procrastination. Conventional advice treats procrastination as a problem of productivity. But many people who procrastinate are not avoiding work itself. They are avoiding the emotional experience attached to the work. The unfinished project allows them to postpone judgment. The delayed decision protects them from discovering whether they are capable of succeeding. The task remains incomplete, and as long as it remains incomplete, the possibility of failure remains hypothetical rather than real. The same dynamic can be found in countless other patterns. Someone who constantly seeks reassurance from others may appear dependent on approval. Yet beneath that behavior, there may be a persistent fear of rejection that was never fully resolved. Someone who remains emotionally distant may appear independent, while actually protecting themselves from experiences that once felt overwhelming. Someone who cannot stop working may look ambitious from the outside, while quietly relying on achievement to create a sense of worth that never developed internally. When viewed from this perspective, many habits begin to reveal a hidden logic. The logic may no longer serve us, but it helps explain why the behavior continues despite its costs. Psychoanalytic thinkers spent decades exploring this territory. They observed that the mind develops defenses not because it wants to create suffering, but because it is attempting to create safety. The problem is that psychological defenses often survive long after the original threat has disappeared. A child who grows up in an environment where mistakes are criticized harshly may learn to fear failure. Years later, perfectionism emerges as a strategy designed to prevent that painful experience from happening again. Someone who experienced rejection during formative years may become exceptionally skilled at anticipating the needs of others in an attempt to avoid abandonment. These adaptations often begin as intelligent responses to difficult circumstances. The difficulty arises when temporary solutions become permanent identities. Over time, people stop experiencing these patterns as behaviors and begin experiencing them as aspects of who they are. What started as a coping mechanism gradually becomes woven into a person's understanding of themselves. the perfectionist begins to believe they simply have high standards. The people pleaser comes to see themselves as naturally selfless. The workaholic identifies with being driven and productive. The anxious individual starts to think anxiety is simply part of their personality. At this point, changing the behavior becomes significantly more complicated because the behavior is no longer standing alone. It is connected to identity. This connection helps explain why meaningful change often feels far more emotional than expected. Most people imagine that growth involves replacing one behavior with another. They expect the process to be straightforward. An unhealthy pattern disappears, a healthier pattern takes its place, and life moves forward. Real psychological change rarely unfolds that way. When a deeply established pattern begins to weaken, the person often experiences something resembling grief. The feeling is difficult to describe because nothing tangible has been lost. No object has disappeared, no relationship has ended, yet there is still a sense that something familiar is slipping away. What is being lost is not merely the habit itself. What is being challenged is the structure of meaning that grew around it. Human beings depend heavily on continuity. We want our lives to make sense. We want a stable story that explains who we are, why we behave as we do, and how we fit into the world around us. Even painful identities provide a form of psychological stability because they reduce uncertainty. Someone who has spent decades thinking of themselves as anxious may discover that healing introduces an unexpected question. If anxiety no longer organizes my decisions, how do I understand myself? Someone who has built their life around earning approval may eventually wonder what determines their value when approval is no longer the primary source of validation. A person whose identity revolves around being the responsible one, the successful one, or the struggling one may eventually confront a similar challenge. The habit is no longer just a behavior. It has become part of a larger narrative. This is one reason many people unconsciously resist change, even while consciously desiring it. One part of the mind wants relief from suffering. Another part fears the uncertainty that accompanies transformation. The conflict is not simply between healthy and unhealthy behavior. It is a conflict between familiarity and possibility. Familiarity has tremendous psychological power. People often assume they want freedom more than anything else, yet freedom requires uncertainty. Freedom asks us to step beyond patterns that have structured our lives for years and enter territory where we no longer know exactly who we are. For this reason, familiar suffering can sometimes feel safer than unfamiliar growth. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote extensively about anxiety as the dizziness of freedom. His observation remains relevant because genuine change often requires confronting possibilities that were previously hidden. As long as a person remains inside an established pattern, the future is relatively predictable. Once that pattern begins to dissolve, new possibilities emerge, and with them comes uncertainty. The mind does not always welcome uncertainty. Instead, it often attempts to return to what feels known. This helps explain why awareness alone does not automatically create change. Many people understand their patterns intellectually. They know where their behaviors originated. They recognize the consequence. They can explain their habits in detail. Yet knowledge by itself does not remove the emotional function that the habit continues to serve. Understanding must eventually move beyond explanation and become a different relationship with oneself. A person who spends years criticizing their habits may believe they are motivating themselves to improve. In reality, self-criticism often strengthens the very dynamics they are trying to escape. Shame narrows awareness. Judgment creates defensiveness. Hostility toward oneself makes honest self-exploration more difficult. Lasting transformation usually begins when curiosity becomes stronger than condemnation. Rather than asking why they keep failing, people begin asking what purpose the behavior has been serving. Instead of viewing the habit as evidence of weakness, they investigate it as evidence of adaptation. The focus shifts away from moral judgment and towards psychological understanding. This shift can be surprisingly profound. Once we recognize that many habits emerged in response to legitimate emotional needs, we begin separating the need from the strategy. The need for safety remains valid even if the method used to achieve it is no longer helpful. The need for belonging remains valid even if approval seeking has become excessive. The need for protection remains understandable even if avoidance is now limiting growth. The habit may be unhealthy. The underlying need often is not. Recognizing this distinction creates space for a different kind of change. Instead of attempting to eliminate a behavior through force, we begin searching for healthier ways of meeting the same psychological need. The mind no longer experiences growth as an attack against itself because the deeper concern is being acknowledged rather than ignored. At this stage, many people begin discovering something unexpected. Some of the characteristics they believed were permanent aspects of their personality turn out to be responses to experiences that happened years earlier. Traits that felt fixed reveal themselves to be flexible. Patterns that appeared inevitable begin to look more like adaptations than destiny. This realization can be unsettling because it raises questions about identity itself. How much of what we call personality reflects who we truly are, and how much reflects strategies developed in response to particular circumstances? How many conclusions about ourselves were formed during periods of fear, loneliness, rejection, or uncertainty, and then carried forward without ever being re-examined? How many stories have we mistaken for facts? These questions do not have simple answers, but they invite a deeper form of self-awareness. The more closely we examine our lives, the more we notice that identity is not a static object waiting to be discovered. It is an evolving process shaped by experience, interpretation, memory, and meaning. Much of what feels permanent may be far more fluid than we assume. Seen from this perspective, personal growth becomes less about constructing a new self and more about revisiting assumptions that have quietly governed our lives for years. Transformation does not necessarily require becoming someone different. In many cases, it involves recognizing that some of the structures we defended so fiercely were built around fears that no longer define our present reality. The defensive pattern once served a purpose. The coping strategy once solved a problem. The adaptation once made sense. Acknowledging this history allows us to approach ourselves with greater honesty and compassion. It becomes possible to appreciate why a pattern developed without continuing to organize our future around it. Over time, the relationship with the habit begins to change. Instead of seeing it as an enemy that must be defeated, we begin to see it as information. It points toward unresolved fears, unmet needs, old conclusions, and emotional conflicts that deserve attention. As understanding deepens, the habit gradually loses some of its authority. Its role becomes clearer. Its necessity becomes weaker. Its connection to identity becomes easier to question. The individual slowly discovers that letting go of a familiar pattern does not require abandoning themselves. What initially felt like a threat to identity begins to reveal itself as an opportunity to relate to identity differently. This may be one of the most important insights in psychological growth. Many people spend years believing they must choose between keeping their familiar patterns and losing themselves entirely. What they eventually discover is that the choice was never that extreme. The habit was not the self. The defense was not the self. The adaptation was not the self. They were attempts to protect the self, and there is a profound difference between those two things. Once that difference becomes clear, change no longer feels like an act of self-destruction. It begins to feel like a gradual release from psychological structures that have outlived their usefulness. What remains is not a completely new person, but someone who can see themselves with greater clarity and less fear. The deepest forms of transformation rarely arrive as dramatic reinventions. More often, they emerge through a growing willingness to question familiar narratives, tolerate uncertainty, and understand the emotional logic behind patterns that once seemed impossible to change. In the end, many of the habits that hurt us survive because they were never merely habits. They were attempts to create safety, stability, and meaning within a complicated emotional world. Understanding that reality does not instantly solve the problem, but it changes the nature of the conversation. Instead of fighting ourselves, we begin learning from ourselves. Instead of asking how to destroy a pattern, we begin exploring why it became necessary. And in that exploration, something essential often becomes visible for the first time. The possibility that growth is not about becoming someone else, but about relating to ourselves with enough awareness that the old protections are no longer required.